My son was being bullied at school for wearing the same old jacket every day. The kids laughed and called him homeless boy. But when I confronted the main bully's mother, she took one look at my son's jacket and fainted. "That's my brother's jacket," she sobbed. But what happened next will leave you absolutely speechless. But before I share this incredible story, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the incredible stories we share here. I never imagined that the jacket I bought to keep my son warm would become the instrument of his daily torment at Jefferson Middle School. Marcus had been drawn to that particular navy blue military-style jacket the moment we walked into Second Chance's thrift store 6 months ago, running his fingers along the worn fabric with the kind of reverence most 12-year-olds reserve for video game consoles or designer sneakers. "This one feels strong, Mom," he'd said, slipping his thin arms into sleeves that were slightly too long, but somehow seemed to fit his spirit perfectly. The jacket was clearly well made, despite its obvious age, with reinforced shoulders and careful stitching that spoke of quality construction rather than mass production. What drew me to approve the purchase wasn't just the reasonable $15 price tag, but the way Marcus's posture changed when he wore it. Straighter, more confident, like he was wearing armor instead of just another piece of clothing. As a single mother teaching 4th grade at Roosevelt Elementary, I'd learned to recognize the small things that could boost a child's confidence, and that jacket seemed to wrap Marcus in a sense of security he'd been lacking since his father walked out on us 2 years earlier. Little did I know that this symbol of strength and protection would soon become the focal point of a campaign of cruelty that would test every maternal instinct I possessed. The same qualities that made Marcus feel invincible would make him a target for bullies who saw his attachment to secondhand clothing as evidence of our family's financial struggles and social vulnerability. The bullying started subtly, as these things often do, with Tyler Brennan and his crew making offhand comments about vintage fashion and retro styles whenever Marcus walked past in the hallways. At first, I dismissed Marcus's concerns as typical middle school social dynamics, the kind of minor conflicts that resolve themselves once children move on to new sources of entertainment. But as September melted into October, the comments became more pointed and deliberate, evolving from casual mockery into systematic psychological warfare designed to isolate and humiliate my son. Tyler, whose father owned the largest car dealership in our Colorado town, and whose mother served on every important community board, wielded his privilege like a weapon against anyone he perceived as beneath his social station. The expensive clothes Tyler wore to school each day, designer jeans, name-brand athletic wear, and shoes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, became silent declarations of superiority that made Marcus's thrift store jacket seem shabby by comparison. I began to notice Marcus taking longer routes to class, eating lunch alone, and avoiding eye contact with classmates who had once been friendly acquaintances. The confident boy who had strutted out of that thrift store 6 months earlier was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone who flinched at loud voices and questioned his own worth based on the reactions of 13-year-old arbiters of social acceptability. When I tried to suggest we shop for something new, Marcus clung to that jacket with desperate determination, insisting it was the only thing that made him feel brave enough to face another day at school. The true scope of Tyler's campaign became clear during a parent-teacher conference in late October when Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus's English teacher, expressed concerns about his declining participation and increasingly withdrawn behavior. "He used to be one of my most engaged students," she explained, her voice heavy with worry and frustration. But lately, he barely speaks unless directly called upon, and I can see him tensing up whenever certain classmates are around." The picture she painted was of systematic intimidation that extended far beyond casual teasing into deliberate exclusion and public humiliation. Tyler had apparently recruited other students into his campaign, creating a social hierarchy where association with Marcus meant risking your own social standing among the school's most influential families. The jacket that had given Marcus confidence was now being used as evidence of our family's supposed inadequacy, with Tyler making comments about people who can't afford real clothes, and staging elaborate performances of disgust whenever Marcus entered a room. Mrs. Rodriguez had tried to address the situation through seating arrangements and group assignments. But Tyler's influence was too widespread, and his methods too subtle for traditional disciplinary measures to be effective. The school's anti-bullying policy looked comprehensive on paper, but in practice, it seemed designed more to protect affluent families from consequences than to protect vulnerable students from harm. I left that conference with a burning certainty that official channels would not provide the justice my son needed, and that I would have to find another way to make Tyler Brennan understand the true cost of his cruelty. That night, I did what teachers do when faced with problems that don't respond to conventional solutions. I began to research. Tyler's family history painted a portrait of generational privilege built on a foundation of carefully maintained appearances and strategic social connections. Richard Brennan's 3-car dealerships had made him wealthy enough to influence local politics and school board decisions, while his wife Catherine leveraged her inherited social status into leadership positions with various charitable organizations throughout the region. Their son was simply following the family playbook, using his inherited advantages to maintain dominance over anyone who threatened the established order through their differences. But as I dug deeper into their family background, I discovered something unexpected, a military connection that seemed at odds with their current lifestyle of conspicuous consumption and social climbing. Catherine's maiden name was Morrison, and public records showed that she'd had a younger brother named Daniel who had served in the Colorado National Guard before his death 18 months earlier during the Boulder County flood response. The timeline caught my attention because it roughly coincided with when that jacket might have been donated to the thrift store where we'd found it. A chill ran down my spine as I began to wonder if there might be more to Marcus's jacket than just its practical warmth and psychological comfort. The possibility that it might have belonged to someone with a story, someone whose service and sacrifice were now being mocked by their own nephew, filled me with a cold determination that went beyond maternal protection into something approaching cosmic justice. The next morning brought fresh evidence of Tyler's escalating campaign against Marcus, and this time I was there to witness it firsthand. I'd arrived at school early for a substitute teaching assignment and positioned myself where I could observe the morning arrival routine without being noticed by the students. What I saw confirmed my worst fears about the systematic nature of Tyler's psychological warfare and the complicity of adults who should have been protecting vulnerable children. Tyler and his 4 closest allies had stationed themselves strategically near the main entrance, creating what could only be described as a gauntlet of humiliation that Marcus had to navigate every single day. As my son approached the building in his navy jacket, Tyler began his morning performance with the practiced cruelty of someone who'd perfected his technique through months of repetition. "Oh, look, it's Jacket Boy wearing his favorite security blanket again," he announced loudly enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. "I wonder if he sleeps in that thing too. Or if his mom makes him hang it up next to the other clothes from the garbage pile." The laughter that erupted from his followers was sharp and vicious, designed not just to amuse but to establish dominance through collective cruelty. I watched my son's shoulders slump as he tried to make himself invisible, his eyes fixed on the ground as he hurried past the group that treated his humiliation like morning entertainment. The casual nature of their cruelty, the way they incorporated it into their daily routine, like brushing their teeth or eating breakfast, spoke to a level of systematic dehumanization that made my hands shake with rage. But what happened next changed everything in ways I couldn't have anticipated. As Tyler continued his performance, mocking Marcus's attachment to old military surplus junk, I noticed another parent approaching the group with obvious concern. Catherine Brennan emerged from her pristine BMW looking every inch the polished community leader, dressed in expensive athleisure wear that probably cost more than my monthly salary. I expected her to walk past without acknowledgement, as she'd done every other time I'd seen her at school events. But instead, she seemed to be listening intently to her son's cruel commentary about Marcus's jacket. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of something that looked like discomfort, or even recognition crossing her face as Tyler described the jacket in mocking detail, but she quickly masked it with her usual expression of polished indifference. "Tyler, that's enough," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tone I hadn't expected from someone who'd previously seemed oblivious to her son's behavior. "We need to get you to class." The brief interaction was over in seconds, but something about Catherine's reaction to Tyler's specific comments about the jacket lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. The way her expression had changed when he mentioned military surplus and old Navy stuff suggested a level of familiarity that went beyond casual observation. As I watched her drive away, a plan began to form in my mind, one that would either expose the truth about that jacket's origins or confirm my growing suspicion that some connections run deeper than coincidence could explain. The confrontation I'd been planning took on new urgency that afternoon when Marcus came home with more than just emotional wounds from Tyler's latest attack. His backpack had been deliberately torn, his homework scattered across the gymnasium floor, and worst of all, Tyler had filmed the entire incident for what he called comedy content for his social media followers. "He said I look like a refugee in this jacket," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible as he recounted how Tyler and his friends had surrounded him during lunch period. "He said poor people shouldn't be allowed in the same school as normal kids because we might be contagious." The casual dehumanization of those words hit me like a physical blow, but what made it worse was the resignation I heard in Marcus's voice, as if he was beginning to believe their lies about his worth and our family's place in the world. That night, as I helped Marcus carefully tape his torn backpack back together, I made a decision that would either bring justice for my son or reveal the true depths of the Brennan family's capacity for denial and deflection. I was going to confront Catherine directly, armed with questions about her family's military connections and her son's specific knowledge of military clothing that seemed too detailed to be casual observation. The Navy jacket hanging in Marcus's closet held secrets that went beyond its practical warmth, and I was determined to uncover the truth about its origins, even if it meant forcing Catherine Brennan to confront uncomfortable realities about what her family had become. The time for diplomatic solutions and faith in institutional justice had passed. Now, it was time for a mother's determination to collide with a privileged family's carefully constructed narrative about themselves. The phone call to Catherine Brennan required 3 attempts and considerable detective work through community organization directories before I finally reached her personal number. When she answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carried that practiced polish of someone accustomed to fielding calls from people seeking her influence or financial support for various causes. "Catherine Brennan speaking. How may I help you?" she said, as if I were a potential donor rather than a concerned parent whose son was being systematically destroyed by her child. I identified myself as Marcus's mother and requested a meeting to discuss what I carefully termed an ongoing situation between our sons that requires adult intervention. Her immediate response was exactly what I'd expected from someone who'd perfected the art of deflecting responsibility while maintaining plausible deniability about her family's actions. "Arco!" "Tyler mentioned something about some social dynamics at school," she replied dismissively, as if months of deliberate psychological torture were merely personality conflicts that would resolve naturally without adult interference. "You know how boys can be at this age. They usually work these things out among themselves without needing parental involvement." The casual way she minimized systematic bullying while maintaining her image as a caring community leader made my jaw clench. But I forced myself to remain diplomatic enough to secure the face-to-face meeting that would either bring resolution or reveal the true extent of her willingness to ignore her son's cruelty. We agreed to meet at her house that Saturday morning, giving me 5 days to prepare for what I knew would be either a breakthrough moment or final confirmation that some people are too invested in their illusions to acknowledge the damage they cause others. Those 5 days of preparation revealed disturbing patterns in the Brennan family's public behavior that suggested Tyler's bullying was learned rather than aberrant behavior that had developed in spite of good parenting. Richard Brennan's business practices had generated multiple complaints to the Better Business Bureau over the years, with a pattern of targeting financially vulnerable customers with predatory lending terms disguised as flexible payment options. His political donations consistently supported candidates who opposed anti-bullying legislation and programs designed to support at-risk youth, while his public statements about personal responsibility and character building through adversity revealed an ideology that blamed victims for their circumstances rather than addressing systemic inequalities. Catherine's charitable work, while publicly celebrated, seemed carefully designed to maximize social visibility while minimizing actual contact with the people she claimed to serve. Board positions and fundraising galas rather than direct service or meaningful advocacy for vulnerable populations. Their family foundation donated generously to organizations that enhanced their social standing, while avoiding causes that might challenge their fundamental assumptions about wealth, privilege, and social hierarchy. The picture that emerged was of a family that used philanthropy and community involvement as weapons for maintaining their position rather than tools for creating genuine positive change. Tyler wasn't developing cruelty in spite of his upbringing. He was following a family template that taught him to use his advantages to maintain dominance over anyone who might threaten the established order through their differences or needs. The morning of our scheduled meeting, I arrived at the Brennan House in Oakwood Heights with a carefully planned strategy that balanced diplomatic engagement with pointed questions designed to expose the contradictions in Catherine's worldview. Their home was exactly what I'd expected, a monument to conspicuous consumption that prioritized impressive appearances over comfortable living spaces. The circular driveway featured Richard's personal luxury vehicle alongside Catherine's BMW, both pristine and expensive enough to represent the annual salaries of several teachers like myself. The landscaping looked professionally maintained with the kind of artificial perfection that required constant intervention to sustain, while the house itself seemed designed more for entertaining influential guests than for raising compassionate children. Catherine greeted me at the front door dressed in what I recognized as designer casual wear, the kind of outfit that appears effortless but actually requires significant investment in both money and time to achieve properly. Her smile was perfectly practiced, revealing professionally whitened teeth and the kind of confident warmth that comes from years of social networking and community leadership training. "Please come in," she said, gesturing toward a living room that looked more like a furniture showroom than a space where people actually relaxed or spent meaningful time together. "I've made coffee, and I hope we can have a productive conversation about whatever concerns you might have regarding the boys." The way she framed our meeting immediately set my teeth on edge. This wasn't about concerns, or the boys in general. This was about her son's systematic campaign to destroy mine through psychological warfare disguised as social dynamics. Catherine's opening strategy was a masterclass in redirecting blame, while appearing concerned and reasonable about what she portrayed as mutual responsibility for resolving interpersonal conflicts between children. "You know, I've been thinking about our phone conversation, and I want you to understand that Richard and I take any issues between children very seriously," she began, settling into an expensive chair with the kind of practiced grace that suggested years of social conditioning in wealthy circles. "Tyler mentioned that your son seems to struggle with fitting in at school, and we've actually been encouraging him to be more inclusive and welcoming to students who come from different backgrounds than ours." The condescension dripping from every carefully chosen word made my hands clench, but I forced myself to nod attentively while she continued with a litany of subtle insults disguised as expressions of maternal concern for Marcus's well-being. She suggested that Marcus might benefit from social skills coaching, and implied that his isolation was largely self-imposed rather than the result of deliberate exclusion orchestrated by her son and his followers. Sometimes children who feel different or insecure can misinterpret normal social interactions as hostile when they're really just reflecting natural peer group dynamics, she explained, as if I were too naive to understand adolescent behavior or my own son's experiences. Her ability to rewrite reality while maintaining an appearance of expertise and compassion was impressive in its audacity, but I could see exactly where Tyler had learned his manipulative skills and casual cruelty toward anyone he perceived as vulnerable or different. As Catherine continued to spin her narrative of Tyler as an innocent victim of Marcus's oversensitivity and social awkwardness, I began to understand that direct confrontation about the bullying would be pointless, given her investment in protecting her family's reputation at any cost. Instead, I shifted the conversation toward the specific details of Tyler's commentary about Marcus's clothing, particularly his apparent expertise regarding military surplus items and vintage naval apparel. "It's interesting that Tyler seems so knowledgeable about military clothing styles," I said, keeping my voice conversational while watching her reaction carefully. "Marcus mentioned that your son has made very specific comments about his jacket, things about Navy surplus and military-issued items that suggest more familiarity than most teenagers would have with those types of clothing." Catherine's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, suggesting that Tyler's knowledge of military apparel wasn't as casual as she might have preferred me to believe. "Well, children pick up information from various sources these days," she replied carefully, her voice maintaining its diplomatic warmth while her eyes revealed something approaching wariness. Video games, movies, internet research, they absorb details about all sorts of topics that might seem surprising to adults who aren't paying attention to their interests." Her explanation was reasonable on the surface, but something about her body language suggested that Tyler's expertise had more personal origins than she was willing to acknowledge. I pressed gently, mentioning that the specific terminology Tyler used seemed quite advanced for casual research, and watched as she began to show signs of genuine discomfort for the first time in our conversation. The breakthrough moment came when I mentioned that Marcus's jacket seemed to be authentic military issue rather than civilian imitation, and Catherine's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack under the weight of whatever memories or associations that information triggered. "Authentic military issue?" she repeated, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been recognition or even alarm. "Are you certain about that? How would you know the difference between genuine military clothing and civilian reproductions?" Her questions came too quickly and with too much intensity for someone who claimed to have only casual knowledge of military apparel, and I realized I'd stumbled onto something significant without fully understanding what it might be. "The construction quality and specific details suggest it's the real thing," I replied, watching her face pale slightly as she processed this information. "Marcus found some paperwork in one of the pockets that looked official, though he couldn't make out much of the writing since it was quite faded." This was a calculated risk on my part. Marcus hadn't actually found any paperwork, but I wanted to see how Catherine would react to the possibility that the jacket might contain identifiable information about its original owner. Her reaction was immediate and telling. She stood up abruptly, her hands trembling slightly as she moved toward the window with the kind of agitated energy that suggested I'd hit a nerve she hadn't expected anyone to find. "What kind of paperwork?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual but failing to hide the urgency underneath. "Could you make out any names or unit designations?" The specificity of her questions revealed knowledge that went far beyond casual curiosity, and I realized that this jacket meant something to Catherine Brennan that she hadn't been prepared to confront. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when Catherine asked if she could see the jacket herself, claiming that her curiosity was piqued by the possibility that it might be an authentic piece of military history rather than just another thrift store find. "I've always been interested in military memorabilia," she said, though her voice carried a tremor that suggested more personal investment than academic curiosity. "If it really is authentic, it might have belonged to someone who served our country, and I think we should treat it with appropriate respect, rather than allowing it to become a source of conflict between the children." Her sudden concern for military service members felt convenient given her previous dismissal of Marcus's attachment to the jacket, but I agreed to bring it to our next meeting, sensing that whatever truth lay hidden in those worn fibers was about to surface whether Catherine was prepared for it or not. As I prepared to leave, she walked me to the door with obvious distraction, her polished facade cracking enough to reveal someone struggling with knowledge or memories she'd been trying to keep buried. "When you bring the jacket next time," she said quietly, "would you mind bringing any paperwork or personal items that might have been left in the pockets?" Even if they're faded or damaged, they might help us understand who it belonged to and how to honor their service properly. The reverence in her voice when she spoke about honoring service was the first genuine emotion I'd heard from her during our entire conversation, and I left the Brennan house with the certainty that our next meeting would reveal truths that would change everything about this situation in ways neither of us could fully anticipate. The week between my first meeting with Catherine and our scheduled follow-up was filled with Marcus sharing increasingly troubling accounts of Tyler's escalating campaign, as if sensing that some kind of reckoning was approaching. Tyler's bullying had evolved beyond casual mockery into what could only be described as psychological warfare, designed to completely destroy Marcus's sense of self-worth and belonging at Jefferson Middle School. The social media campaign had expanded to include doctored photos of Marcus with captions like, "Fashion disaster alert," and "When your mom shops at the homeless store," shared across multiple platforms where other students could add their own cruel commentary for Tyler's approval. But what disturbed me most was Tyler's apparent inside knowledge about military protocols and terminology that he was using to make his attacks on Marcus's jacket more specific and cutting. He said my jacket looked like something a weekend warrior would wear to pretend to be a real soldier, Marcus reported after another brutal day at school. He knew things about different military branches and ranks that made it sound like he was some kind of expert, not just some rich kid making stuff up. The precision of Tyler's cruelty suggested that his knowledge came from personal experience rather than internet research, and I began to suspect that Catherine's family had military connections she hadn't mentioned during our previous conversation. The possibility that Tyler was using intimate knowledge of military service to mock someone wearing authentic military clothing added a layer of irony and betrayal that made his behavior even more incomprehensible and morally bankrupt than I'd originally understood. My investigation into the Morrison family's military history yielded information that cast Catherine's behavior during our meeting in an entirely new light and suggested that her discomfort about the jacket ran much deeper than casual concern for military memorabilia. Public records and obituary archives revealed that Daniel Morrison, Catherine's younger brother, had indeed served in the Colorado National Guard's 115th Engineer Battalion and had died 18 months earlier during flood response operations in Boulder County. The newspaper accounts of his death painted a picture of genuine heroism. Danny had saved multiple families from rising waters before going back for an elderly couple trapped in their basement, and the building had collapsed while he was inside trying to reach them. The timing aligned perfectly with when authentic military clothing might have been donated to thrift stores by grieving families unable to bear keeping their loved ones' belongings. But what made this discovery even more significant was learning that Danny Morrison had been posthumously awarded the Colorado Medal of Honor for his sacrifice, making him a genuine war hero whose service gear was now being mocked by his own nephew. The cruel irony was almost too much to process. Tyler was systematically tormenting Marcus for wearing the jacket of someone who embodied everything Tyler's privileged upbringing had failed to teach him about courage, sacrifice, and genuine service to others. If my suspicions were correct, Catherine had spent our entire first meeting listening to me describe her son's cruelty toward someone wearing her brother's jacket, while maintaining a facade of ignorance that was either incredibly well acted or represented a level of psychological denial that bordered on pathological. The second meeting with Catherine was scheduled for Saturday morning, and I arrived at the Brennan house carrying Marcus's navy jacket, along with a growing sense that this confrontation would either bring justice or reveal the true extent of one family's capacity for self-deception and moral blindness. Catherine greeted me at the door with obvious nervousness, her usual polished confidence replaced by something approaching anxiety as her eyes immediately fixed on the jacket draped over my arm. "Thank you for bringing that," she said, her voice lacking its previous authority and social warmth. "I've been thinking about our conversation all week, and I realize there might be more to this situation than I initially understood." Her admission that she hadn't fully grasped the situation during our first meeting was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of responsibility I'd heard from her, but I remained skeptical about her willingness to confront the full truth about Tyler's behavior. We settled into her living room with the jacket between us like evidence in a trial. its worn fabric suddenly carrying the weight of everything that had been hidden, denied, and deliberately ignored by adults who should have been protecting vulnerable children. "Before we examine this more closely," I said, maintaining eye contact with Catherine, "I want you to understand that this isn't just about clothing or teenage social dynamics. Your son has been systematically destroying mine through a campaign of psychological torture that would be considered criminal harassment if it were happening between adults." The directness of my statement seemed to surprise her, but I was done with diplomatic language that allowed people like Catherine to hide behind euphemisms and minimize the real damage their children were inflicting on others. Catherine's reaction when she first held the jacket was immediate and visceral, her hands trembling as she examined details that were invisible to my untrained eye, but apparently carried profound meaning for someone with intimate knowledge of military service and family history. She found the faded unit patch near the left breast pocket and traced it with her finger, while her breathing became increasingly shallow and rapid. "Colorado National Guard, 115th Engineer Battalion," she whispered, her voice barely audible as the implications of what she was holding began to register fully. They only issued these patches to active members of Danny's unit. The confirmation that this was indeed her brother's jacket hit her like a physical blow, and I watched her carefully maintained composure crumble as months of denial and willful ignorance collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. "This is my brother's jacket," she said, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Danny died 18 months ago saving people from the flooding in Boulder County, and I donated all his belongings because I couldn't bear to have them in the house where they would remind me of what we'd lost." The admission that she'd been the one responsible for the jacket ending up in a thrift store where my son could buy it added another layer of cosmic irony to the entire situation. But what destroyed me was understanding that Tyler had been mocking his own uncle's memory without knowing it. The boy she'd raised to believe his privilege made him superior to others had been systematically tormenting someone wearing the jacket of the hero uncle he claimed to admire and respect. The paperwork Marcus had supposedly found in the jacket's pockets turned out to be real after all. Catherine discovered a small, folded note in Danny's handwriting that had somehow survived 18 months and multiple wash cycles. As she read her brother's words aloud, her voice breaking with each sentence, I began to understand the full tragedy of what had unfolded over the past months. "Remember that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down," Danny had written in what appeared to be a personal reminder or motivational note. "The kids we work with at the community center need to see that being different doesn't make you weak. It makes you unique and valuable. Never let anyone convince you that having less money or fewer advantages makes you worth less as a human being." The note could have been written specifically for Marcus's situation, as if Danny Morrison had somehow foreseen that his jacket would end up protecting a vulnerable child who needed exactly that message of hope and validation. Catherine sobbed as she read her brother's words, finally understanding that Tyler had been systematically destroying everything Danny had stood for while using the family's grief and financial resources to avoid consequences for his cruelty. "Danny would be ashamed of what Tyler has become," she said through her tears. "And he'd be ashamed of me for allowing it to continue by making excuses and protecting Tyler from the consequences of his actions." The admission marked the first time Catherine had acknowledged Tyler's behavior as deliberate cruelty rather than normal social dynamics, and I realized that we'd finally broken through her wall of denial and reached something approaching genuine accountability. But the most devastating revelation came when Catherine explained how Tyler's behavior had been shaped not just by privilege, but by unprocessed grief and guilt over his uncle's death. Tyler worshipped Danny, she admitted, clutching the jacket like a lifeline while struggling to make sense of how her hero-worshipping son had become someone who would mock the very qualities he'd once admired in his uncle. When Danny died, Tyler blamed himself because he'd been supposed to volunteer with the flood response team that weekend, but chose to attend a friend's birthday party instead. He convinced himself that if he'd been there, he could have somehow prevented Danny's death or died alongside him like a real hero. The psychological complexity of Tyler's guilt and self-loathing provided context for his cruelty without excusing it. suggesting that his systematic campaign against Marcus was actually a displaced form of self-punishment, projected onto someone who reminded him of his own perceived inadequacy and cowardice. "He's been trying to prove he's nothing like the weak people Danny died trying to save," Catherine continued, her voice heavy with understanding that came too late to prevent months of damage. By tormenting Marcus for being vulnerable and different, Tyler was rejecting everything about himself that he thought made him unworthy of Danny's memory. The revelation that Tyler's cruelty stemmed from unresolved grief and trauma made the situation even more tragic. But it also suggested that genuine healing might be possible if we could address the root causes rather than just the symptoms of his behavior. As Catherine held her brother's jacket and finally understood the full scope of what her family had done, I realized that our next challenge would be transforming this moment of recognition into lasting change that honored Danny's memory, while protecting vulnerable children like Marcus from future harm. The transformation that began in Catherine's living room that Saturday morning was neither immediate nor magical, but it was genuine and comprehensive in ways that surprised even my most optimistic expectations for meaningful change. Catherine's recognition of her brother's jacket had shattered her carefully constructed narrative about Tyler's behavior, forcing her to confront the reality that she'd been enabling systematic cruelty while honoring a hero who would have despised everything her son had become. But acknowledgement of the problem was only the first step in a process that would require sustained commitment to addressing both the symptoms and the underlying causes of Tyler's campaign against Marcus. "I need to understand exactly what Tyler has done to your son," Catherine said through her tears, her voice carrying a weight of determination I hadn't heard from her before. Not the sanitized version I've been telling myself, but the truth about every cruel thing he's said and done over these past months. I spent the next hour providing a detailed account of Tyler's systematic campaign, from the daily harassment in school hallways to the social media posts designed to humiliate Marcus in front of his peers. Catherine listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each new revelation about the psychological warfare her son had been conducting while she made excuses about normal teenage behavior and social dynamics that work themselves out naturally. By the time I finished recounting months of deliberate cruelty, Catherine was sobbing not just for her brother's memory, but for the child her family had failed to raise with the values Danny had embodied throughout his life. The confrontation between Catherine and Tyler that afternoon was a masterclass in parental accountability that I witnessed from their kitchen window while waiting for Catherine to return from collecting her son from a friend's house. Tyler's initial reaction to seeing his uncle's jacket laid out on the dining room table was confusion, followed by growing horror as he began to understand the connection between his campaign against Marcus and the uncle he'd claimed to admire more than anyone else in the world. "That's Uncle Danny's jacket," he whispered, his confident cruelty replaced by something approaching panic as the full implications of what he'd been doing began to register. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was his." Catherine's response was swift and devastating, stripping away every excuse and rationalization Tyler had used to justify his behavior, while making clear that ignorance was no longer acceptable as a defense. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," she said, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard from her before. "You were so busy feeling superior to Marcus that you never bothered to actually look at what you were mocking. You turned your uncle's memory into a weapon to hurt someone exactly like the kids Danny spent his life trying to protect." The conversation that followed lasted over an hour, with Catherine systematically dismantling Tyler's worldview, while holding him accountable for every cruel comment and deliberate act of exclusion he'd inflicted on my son. But what impressed me most was her insistence that Tyler's grief and guilt over Danny's death, while understandable, could never excuse the systematic harm he'd caused to someone more vulnerable than himself. The consequences Catherine implemented for Tyler were immediate, comprehensive, and designed to address the root causes of his behavior rather than simply punishing the symptoms of his cruelty. His phone was confiscated indefinitely, his social media accounts were permanently deleted, and his allowance was redirected toward making restitution to Marcus for the emotional damage caused by months of systematic harassment. But the most significant consequence was Catherine's decision to enroll Tyler in the same community service program where Danny had volunteered before his death, working with at-risk youth who faced the same kinds of challenges that had made Marcus a target for bullying. "You're going to spend every Saturday for the next year learning what your uncle actually stood for," Catherine told her son, her voice leaving no room for negotiation or complaint. "You're going to work with kids who don't have your advantages, and you're going to understand why Danny believed that protecting vulnerable people was more important than protecting your own comfort or social status." The community service wasn't just busy work designed to keep Tyler occupied. It was specifically structured to put him in situations where he'd be helping children who reminded him of Marcus. Kids who struggled with poverty, family instability, and social isolation. Catherine also arranged for Tyler to attend counseling sessions focused on processing his grief over Danny's death in healthy ways that honored his uncle's memory, instead of betraying it through cruelty toward others. The apology Tyler delivered to Marcus 3 weeks later was neither scripted nor performative, but rather the result of genuine understanding about the harm he'd caused and his responsibility for making meaningful amends. I watched from across the school cafeteria as Tyler approached Marcus's table alone, without his usual crew of followers and with obvious nervousness about how his former victim might receive his words. "I wanted to apologize for everything I did to you," Tyler said, his voice lacking the confident cruelty that had characterized all their previous interactions. "I found out that the jacket I was making fun of belonged to my uncle who died saving people from floods. He would hate what I became, and he would hate that I hurt you for wearing something that represented everything he believed in." Marcus listened carefully, his natural empathy allowing him to see the genuine remorse in Tyler's face, even while maintaining appropriate caution about trusting someone who had caused him so much pain. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Tyler continued. "But I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was, and I'm going to spend however long it takes learning how to be the kind of person my uncle would have been proud of." The apology wasn't a Hollywood moment of instant reconciliation, but it was a genuine acknowledgement of harm done and a commitment to personal transformation that went beyond mere words into concrete actions and behavioral changes. The systemic changes Catherine implemented at Jefferson Middle School using her position on the school board were equally impressive, transforming the paper anti-bullying policy into a comprehensive program with real teeth and genuine accountability measures. She pushed for mandatory training for all staff on recognizing subtle forms of harassment, established anonymous reporting systems that protected vulnerable students instead of protecting the institution from liability, and created consequences that addressed the underlying attitudes driving bullying behavior, rather than just punishing its most obvious symptoms. "I realized that my social position gave me the power to protect kids like Marcus instead of kids like Tyler," she explained during one of our regular check-ins about both boys' progress. "That I'd been using my influence to shield my son from consequences instead of using it to shield vulnerable children from harm." Her advocacy work became a form of redemption that honored her brother's memory while creating lasting changes that would benefit at-risk students for years to come. The scholarship fund she established in Danny's name wasn't just about providing financial assistance. It recognized students who demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity and used their experiences to help others, rather than to justify cruelty toward those they perceived as weak. Marcus became not just the first recipient of the Danny Morrison Resilience Scholarship, but also its youngest advocate, helping other students understand that strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The most unexpected development in this entire journey came when Tyler specifically requested that Marcus help him design the community service program that would honor Danny's memory while addressing the root causes of bullying behavior in their school and community. "I need to understand what it felt like to be you," Tyler told Marcus during one of their supervised conversations facilitated by the school counselor. "I need to know how my actions affected you so I can make sure I never make anyone feel that way again." Their collaboration on the anti-bullying program wasn't forced or artificial, but grew naturally from Tyler's genuine desire to transform his guilt and grief into something constructive that would prevent other vulnerable children from experiencing what Marcus had endured. Marcus's willingness to work with his former tormentor demonstrated a level of emotional maturity and forgiveness that impressed every adult involved in their situation. But it also reflected his understanding that real healing required addressing the systems and attitudes that had allowed the bullying to continue for so long. Together, they created workshops for younger students about the difference between confidence and cruelty, peer mentorship programs that paired privileged kids with those facing economic hardships, and educational initiatives that helped families understand how unprocessed grief and trauma could manifest as systematic harm toward others. The transformation of their relationship from predator and prey to collaborative advocates became a powerful example of how genuine accountability and meaningful consequences could create positive change that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in the original conflict. 6 months after that life-changing Saturday morning in Catherine's living room, I found myself sitting in the audience at Jefferson Middle School's annual recognition ceremony, watching Marcus receive not just the Danny Morrison Resilience Scholarship, but also the school's first-ever Peer Advocacy Award for his work with Tyler in creating anti-bullying programs that had already been adopted by 3 other schools in our district. As Marcus walked across the stage in a new jacket, one Catherine had insisted on buying as part of her family's ongoing efforts to make meaningful amends, I reflected on how profoundly this entire experience had changed not just our immediate situation, but the broader culture of accountability and compassion within our community. The boy who had once been systematically tormented for wearing secondhand clothes was now being celebrated for his resilience, his forgiveness, and his commitment to preventing other vulnerable children from experiencing the isolation and cruelty he had endured. Tyler sat in the front row with his parents, applauding genuinely for the classmate he had once treated as subhuman, his 6 months of community service having taught him that true strength comes from protecting others rather than exploiting their vulnerabilities. The transformation wasn't complete. Healing from systematic trauma takes years, not months, but the foundation for lasting change had been established through honest accountability, meaningful consequences, and genuine commitment to addressing root causes rather than just managing symptoms. The Danny Morrison Memorial Community Center, which opened that spring in a renovated building donated by the Brennan family, became a living testament to how personal tragedy could be transformed into community healing when grief was channeled toward constructive purposes rather than destructive ones. The center's programs specifically focused on at-risk youth who faced the same challenges that had made Marcus a target for bullying: poverty, family instability, social isolation, and the kind of vulnerability that privileged children often interpreted as weakness rather than recognizing as strength. Tyler spent every Saturday there as part of his ongoing community service commitment, but his involvement had evolved from court-ordered punishment into genuine passion for youth advocacy and social justice work. Working with these kids taught me that having advantages means you have responsibilities, not privileges, Tyler explained during the center's grand opening ceremony. My uncle knew that, and Marcus knew that, but I had to learn it the hard way by hurting someone before I understood what real strength actually looks like. His work with younger children who reminded him of Marcus had given him perspective on how his privileged upbringing could be used as a tool for lifting others up, rather than maintaining artificial hierarchies based on wealth and social status. The mentorship program he developed paired students from affluent families with those facing economic hardships, creating cross-class friendships that broke down the social barriers that had made systematic bullying possible in the first place. The ripple effects of Marcus's story extended far beyond our immediate community when Catherine decided to share their family's experience with regional educational conferences and parenting organizations throughout Colorado. Her presentations about the connection between unprocessed grief, privilege, and bullying behavior became powerful tools for helping other families recognize warning signs before their children's pain manifested as cruelty toward others. And I spent 2 years making excuses for Tyler's behavior because acknowledging what he'd become would have meant admitting that our family wasn't as perfect as we pretended to be. Catherine explained to audiences of parents who saw uncomfortable reflections of their own families in her story. It took seeing my brother's jacket and understanding that Tyler had been mocking the memory of someone he claimed to love to break through my denial and force me to confront the reality of what we'd created. Her advocacy work focused particularly on helping affluent families understand how their children's advantages could become weapons when not balanced with education about empathy, service, and genuine respect for human dignity, regardless of economic circumstances. The workshop she developed helped parents recognize the difference between protecting their children from consequences and actually protecting their children from becoming the kind of people who needed protection from consequences in the first place. Marcus's role in these educational initiatives grew naturally from his desire to ensure that other vulnerable children wouldn't have to endure what he'd experienced during those dark months when Tyler's campaign had made school feel like a daily battleground. His presentations to middle school students about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of authentic strength resonated with young people who recognized their own struggles in his story. Being different isn't something to be ashamed of. Marcus would tell audiences of children who faced their own challenges with poverty, family instability, or social exclusion. The jacket I wore every day reminded me that someone brave had worn it before me, and that helped me remember that I could be brave too, even when other people were trying to make me feel weak or worthless. His partnership with Tyler in these presentations provided powerful evidence that genuine accountability and meaningful change were possible, even in situations that seemed hopeless from the outside. Their joint workshops demonstrated that healing required both the victim's willingness to forgive and the perpetrator's commitment to understanding the full impact of their actions while taking concrete steps to prevent similar harm in the future. Together, they created educational materials that helped other schools develop more effective anti-bullying programs based on restorative justice principles rather than purely punitive approaches that often failed to address underlying attitudes and behaviors. The most profound change came in how both families approached the intersection of privilege, responsibility, and community engagement in the years following their initial confrontation. Catherine used her social capital and financial resources to support legislation that provided better mental health services for grieving families, ensuring that other children wouldn't channel their unprocessed trauma into systematic cruelty toward vulnerable peers. Richard Brennan restructured his business practices to eliminate predatory lending and created scholarship programs for students from low-income families, acknowledging that his previous practices had contributed to the economic inequalities that made children like Marcus targets for class-based discrimination. We realized that our wealth and influence came with obligations we'd been ignoring, Catherine explained during an interview for a documentary about bullying and social justice in schools. Danny's death could have been meaningless tragedy, but Marcus and Tyler working together helped us understand how to honor his memory by actually living the values he died defending. Their family foundation shifted focus from high-visibility charitable work that enhanced their social status to direct service programs that addressed root causes of inequality and social exclusion in their community. The changes weren't just cosmetic or temporary. They represented fundamental shifts in how the Brennan family understood their place in the world and their responsibilities to others who hadn't been born with the same advantages. As I watched Marcus and Tyler work together at the community center on a recent Saturday morning, I was struck by how completely their relationship had been transformed from predator and prey into genuine collaborative partnership focused on preventing other children from experiencing what they'd been through together. Marcus's natural empathy and Tyler's hard-won understanding of privilege and responsibility had combined to create educational programs that were already making measurable differences in how their peers approached social hierarchies and conflict resolution. I think Uncle Danny would be proud of what we've built here," Tyler said, as he helped Marcus organize materials for a workshop about resilience and forgiveness. "Not because we fixed everything perfectly, but because we learned from our mistakes and used them to help other people avoid making the same ones." Marcus nodded, adjusting the display case where Danny's jacket was preserved alongside photos and stories of his service. surrounded by letters from children who had been inspired by his example to stand up for vulnerable classmates or seek help when they found themselves becoming bullies rather than heroes. The jacket that had once been a symbol of Marcus's vulnerability had become a reminder that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences in each other's lives through courage, compassion, and commitment to justice rather than just personal comfort. As I left the community center that day, I realized that sometimes the most powerful form of healing comes not from forgetting painful experiences, but from transforming them into wisdom that can protect others from suffering the same harm, creating legacies of understanding that extend far beyond the individuals who first endured the pain and found the courage to turn it into something meaningful and lasting. If you enjoyed this incredible journey, click the subscribe button. For you, it might be just a click, but for us, it's the fuel we need to keep finding and sharing these incredible stories. Speaking of incredible stories, I have another one that will blow your mind, already on the waiting list on the screen. Click it right now. Trust us, you won't want to miss this one. See you there, and thank you for being part of our community. Until next time.